welcome Bernard Catt. Bernard qualified as a clinical psychologist in 1974 and like me did in-service training, although in Manchester rather than me in London, leading to the BPS diploma. He's also a health psychologist. I've encountered Bernard's work a number of times over the last 20 years, but I know that he was extremely innovative in the work that he did in initiating psychological services within GP practices in Northumberland. And he then went on to manage NHS psychology services in North Durham from 1984. He, like Mike, has been a chair of the DCP between 1980 and 83. And he defines this as remaining intermittently active within the profession ever since, which I think is overly modest, in fairness, Bernard. He's director currently of Presynapse, Psychological Services, and a director of the Centre for Applied Psychology, and he will be offering his perspectives for the next half hour.
Thanks, Noel. And can I start by adding my tribute to those already offered to Mike Wang? I've only known him personally over the last year or two. I knew of him before that because of the very innovative course at Hull that he was running. But in the last year or two, he and I have been involved together on trying to move the Division of Clinical Psychology on to thinking more creatively about the future. And I've been very impressed by his determination and vision and wisdom. Today, I've been hearing about what else he's done, and I share Peter's feeling of awe. How on earth have you done it, Mike? Such a breadth of achievement. Well, congratulations on your retirement, and I hope it doesn't mean that you're going to stop working for the profession, because we need you. I hope you like the picture. It's a picture of the new dawn arising over clinical psychology. Honestly, I think clinical psychologists have got an excellent future. But we do have to learn some lessons from the past, and I think we need to take a cool look at the way that people get access to the services that we offer. Now, Jamie's already given you a bit of a historical summary of what's happened in the health service, but I'm going to say a little bit more. I think there have been 4 ages in the NHS. The first one started in 1946 and went on to 1974, and that was the NHS as set up by the post-war government. For a lot of reasons, the governments thought that the NHS needed a whole different approach to its management, and so we had in 1974 new management arrangements. And that was, to some extent, about trying to integrate things which were disintegrated at that time. The community health services, the public health services, general practice, they were all independent of the hospital services. The DCP had been launched in 1965, and it was really quite a small profession at that time. I joined the profession there, 74. I think I had the first contract issued by the new Northumberland Area Health Authority. They had my name spelt wrong, they had my address wrong, and they had my date of birth wrong. And I kind of feel that that was symbolic about something. The Trethowne report was indeed very important, and I think that there was a kind of golden age for clinical psychology, which was between 1977 and 1987. What made it a golden age was that, owing to the way in which psychology had to fit in with the management arrangements set up in 1974, psychology services had their own budgets, they had their own management, and senior psychologists, called district psychologists in those days, were involved in planning for populations. So there was needs assessment, and there was a certain amount of opportunity to contribute to service design. By 1990, 1991, all of that had gone, as Jamie mentioned. We lost control of our budgets, and to some extent we lost control of our management as a result of changes in 1985, the introduction of general management. But I think the real killer was this one, because that's what separated the clinical psychologists from any kinds of needs assessment or service planning. And as I will go on to explain in further slides, it kind of put us into a compartment which limited us, constrained us, meant that we were not able and haven't been able to contribute what we could and should be contributing to health services. Something strange happened here. I'll just stay with that point that I've just made about being constrained, because Jamie mentioned it. It was the target culture and the contract culture. And I think it was within that culture that general managers started focusing us on face-to-face services and minimising unit costs, and not allowing us to think for ourselves. I think many clinical psychologists would have wished their purchasers, commissioners, managers to have taken the advice of Steve Jobs, who was the head of Apple. It doesn't make sense to hire smart people and then tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do, except in the National Health Service. There was no shortage of ideas for improving the situation, for making clinical psychology more effective. There was the Management Advisory Service report in 1989. I think that Jamie or Peter already mentioned the New Ways of Working project in 2007. Very good ideas around. Many of them seemed to go nowhere. Why was that? Well, I think the answer is actually quite straightforward. It was actually Aesop who despaired as long ago as 580 BC. NHS clinical psychologists, as an NHS profession, didn't set up an NHS-based organisation to represent them to government and other NHS professions. This goes back to the thinking of the founding fathers, really, in 1965, who were very attached to the role of the BPS. And as things rolled on, clinical psychologists looked to the division and to the society to fill the gap which existed because no NHS-based organisation had been set up. But the DCP couldn't fill the gap because of its position within the society. And the society wouldn't fill the gap, I think, for perfectly good reasons of its own. But what that meant was that there was no system for actually pushing things forward and getting them to happen. Whilst we were all feeling frustrated about that, the coalition government came into power in 2010, bringing with it Andrew Lansley's Health and Social Care Act. So this started happening, the purchase of healthcare from non-NHS bodies, which has been going steadily up and up and up. It may be true that £13 billion sounds like a lot of money. It is in fact less than 10%, just less than 10% of the health service budget. But I think you've got the picture of the trend there. Anybody who was watching the BBC News last night will have seen these figures. Slightly different ones, depends on where you look as to whether they just focus it on NHS spending or whether it's all healthcare spending. But the fact is that the United Kingdom spends less of its national wealth on healthcare than most other developed European countries. No politician has ever stood up and said why, or tried to justify it or explain it. It's just a matter of fact. But what's more worrying, and they didn't talk about this on the news last night, is this. That figure is going down. And you may think, oh well, it's just a grand figure. Have a look at this. This is the independent, just less than 2 weeks ago. NHS spending per person will be cut next year, ministers confirm. What does that mean? It means more closures, more redundancies, more downgradings, more pressure, continuing limitation on salaries. Senior psychologists haven't had a proper salary rise for how many years? 6 years, 7 years, something like that. I turn to Shakespeare for some wisdom. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. In other words, clinical psychology started out as psychology in the National Health Service. In fact, when I came into the job, the only psychologists in the health service were clinical psychologists, because you couldn't be a member of the clinical division unless you were employed in the health service. That's not true now, but the fact is the two things were one and the same. But the NHS is no longer the organisation that it was. It may not survive in its current form for another 3 years. Why 3 years? Because we've got 3 years to the next election. We're on a full sea, and we are, I think, in danger of losing our ventures. Perhaps we need a lifeboat. We certainly need to consider what action to take. So, I'm retired from the NHS many years now. I was fortunate I had mental health officer status, so I've been able to, as it were, have a second career as a clinical psychologist outside of NHS employment. But because many of you will be looking towards 30, 40, if you're an undergraduate, potentially even 50 years of a career ahead of you. So we really do need to take this issue seriously. Nothing I'm going to say precludes the possibility of employment by an NHS trust or a commercial contractor or a charity, but make no mistake, it'll be on their terms, not on yours. And there is the possibility of being self-employed. If any of you are aware of the independent practitioners bit of the BPS, you'll know that lots and lots of people are becoming self-employed at the moment, and some of them send in rather sad little messages saying, I wish I knew how to do it, can anybody help me please? The problem is that they're in competition with, well, I've said Uncle Tom Cobley and all, because that means that I don't have to be rude about any specific category of person. But the fact is, there's a lot of competition out there. Two other reasons why it's really important to think ahead. A career as a psychologist means somebody believes that you're good at something they want. Of course. But they've got to be willing to pay for it. It's all very well being altruistic. When I've given this sort of talk before, I've been criticised by some people for letting the health service down. Well, I'm not. What I'm saying is, if you want a career as a psychologist, you've got to think, well, who's going to pay me? If there's any academics in the audience, let me remind you that it's even more important for you, because wanting a career as a psychologist is one of the big drivers of people coming into undergraduate psychology. And if there is no prospect of any kind of employment as a psychologist, why is anybody going to come into psychology? What's going to happen to your courses? Right? So we really do need to think about careers for people. So what I'm going to do is, I called it a thought development, just as an analogy with a thought experiment. We're looking for a way of providing services that maximises benefit and accessibility for our clients, but provides a basis for personal growth and professional development for psychologists. Psychologists are highly selected, clinical psychologists I should say, are highly selected, highly trained people. Around 3,700 applicants every year. This goes from 2010. around 590 people taken onto courses each year. For each person who is selected for clinical psychology training, we turn away 5 people, most of whom would be good clinical psychologists, I'm sure. The constraint is, of course, NHS funding and other NHS issues like the provision of placements. But what it means is that the people who get in must, in their own way, believe it or not, be very special people. Don't know if you feel special, but you certainly are. So what have they been selected for? What's it all about? Well, I think, in very general, people look to psychologists for help to solve their problems and to achieve their aims. I think those are, I mean applied psychologists, of course. But I think those are sort of a general statement which covers most of applied psychology. People isn't just individuals, it includes communities and organisations. And the way in which psychologists help people is actually quite complex, because sometimes it's by supporting the client's own efforts, sometimes it's by psychologist-led interventions or innovations. Hard to explain that sort of thing to other people. So let's try and apply our thoughts to what it is that's distinctive and has particular value. Unfortunately, trying to give you a quick and easy answer to that would almost defeat me, because the answer is it's about the level of work. And I don't have time to give you a little lecture on the level of work. If you want to follow up the concept, look for books by Elliot Jakes, who worked at the Tavistock, the research on clinical psychology and clinical psychological services by John Overtveit in the early 1980s, and the work by Derek Mowbray for the Management Advisory Service in 1989. But basically, level 3 work, which is what everybody talks about, is not face-to-face work, which is just case by case. It's where people take a condition, a topic, an issue, a need, and develop appropriate services, appropriate ideas, appropriate procedures, appropriate techniques. So undoubtedly, clinical psychologists lead and provide skilled knowledge-based services, but I think one of the things that clinical psychologists are particularly good at is innovation. Why do I say that? Well, for heaven's sake, you know, last week or week before, I was at the DCP annual conference in Liverpool, and there was the publishers all with their stands loaded down with books of really good ideas by psychologists, developments, techniques, approaches. Even if you look in Clinical Psychology Forum, you gave it a puff there earlier on, Jamie. Clinical Psychology Forum is full of interesting ideas about how to improve things, how to develop things. Nothing very much happens with a lot of them. That's one of the things that I'm trying to tackle here. One of the things that we're not particularly good at but need to get better at is helping to create efficient and accessible services. Some people are able to get involved in that, but not all. So I think that there is a particular level of work that psychologists are particularly important for. 2 points to consider, which I don't have much time to go into. I think that so far as clinical work is concerned, senior psychologists probably put insufficient time into case management. In other words, supervising cases, delegating to accountable staff. It's important that we maintain our capacity in neuropsychology. We are probably the only group in the health service who are able to bring together the social and the neuro. This one I would also say is important, but I'm not going to spend time on it because Peter and Jamie have already said it. What happened was, in 1991, we started to get forced into one-to-one patient services, and that meant that we got forced into quite a medical way of thinking, and it's really important that we get out of it. I'm just going to touch on another important strategic issue, which is about applied psychologists. One applied psychology or many. It's this bit here. How big is that? I've drawn a little diagram in which the core of applied psychology is a sort of a small overlap between all the different groups. But go to many health service departments and counselling psychologists and health psychologists are treated as almost interchangeable with clinical psychologists as a direct substitute, which would suggest that, at least so far as the people running those departments are concerned, they think that that is a big square, not a little square. And that causes certain problems, but one of the things that I would want to say about it, in relation to points raised by Peter and Jamie, is that I think that psychologists should be competing with everybody else, not with each other. So what we're looking for is a way of working together. And if you imagine a person who wants the help of a psychologist, one of the questions that they find themselves asking, and I know because in my position as an independent practitioner, they will phone up and say to me, what sort of a psychologist do I need? And how do I find one? Will they be able to do the job I want doing? Why has it got to be so difficult for people to find a psychologist? So, the concept, Centres for Applied Psychology, originally developed by Derek Mowbray, and by the sounds of it being implemented in the Southwest. That's great. A group of applied psychologists, their staff and subcontractors bound together into a viable business organisation. Maybe physical. You might have a centre that actually got a front door. It could be virtual, a portal. But what we're talking about is generic services provided by specialists. One of the differences between the three of us as speakers is that Peter was suggesting that applied psychologists should coalesce into a single group. I'm not sure that Jamie thinks that. I certainly think that that is not where you start. What you start is by offering generic services, but you respect people's separate expertise and maximise on it. So a centre of applied psychology should be a place where people can go to find psychologists and to find psychological services. Can you help me? Yes, we can. It's up to the centre to identify the client's needs and, building on applied psychology services, present the face that fits the need and put together the requisite team to respond to that requirement. It may be a long-term requirement, you know, it may be that people are seconded for long periods of time to clinical teams or what have you, or it may be a short-term one, a project. Psychologists have families and mortgages, and having watched the news last night, I thought, oops, I should have changed that. Psychologists have families and have to pay rent as well. But they do need people to know where they are. Otherwise, how can they have careers? So we need a promotional system. We're going to be talking about national level promotion in the discussion, I'm sure. But it does seem to me that the bit that the old clinical psychologists, our predecessors, failed to tackle by creating a national representative structure still needs tackling. The regional level of promotion is particularly important because for most of the country, regional media, radio, TV, newspapers, are the way in which the majority of the public get their news and their information and their adverts. And then there's the local and personal level of promotion. It seems to me that in work settings there are 5 rules which we should all be observing. And you may think they're a bit trite, but believe me, I've been told that I shouldn't be saying this because it might be offensive to other professions. Well, blow that. Always use your titles, clinical psychologist and doctor, because we ourselves have to sell through our actions, through our behaviour, through our relationships, the value of what we're doing. Make sure that people know how to access you and your services. Even in clinical team settings, it's important that people know who you are, what your phone number is, where your office is, You know, how can you develop working relationships with people if they're puzzled about who you are and where you reside? Have ready a brief, clear answer to what do you do, what clinical psychologists do. By brief answer, I mean what the business people call an elevator pitch. So you get into the lift and you discover yourself standing next to the chief executive. And you say to the chief executive, "Oh, hello, I recognise you, you are so-and-so." And he says, "Oh, hello." And you say, "I'm Bernard Catt, I'm a clinical psychologist, and what I do is X, Y, and Z." And the whole thing should take no longer than 30 seconds. What you're after is to arouse their curiosity, to arouse their interest, potentially to get another conversation. Politely claim leadership of or interest in psychological issues and developments. This is the one that got me into trouble. Because I was saying, when you go along to a meeting, if people are intruding on your patch, thank you, I've got 5 minutes left. If people are intruding on your patch, don't sit there quietly, say it. You know, life actually welcomes, in its own way, pushy people. Being unassertive won't get you anywhere. And I think equally important in its own way is to make the time to meet other clinical psychologists in your work setting to share ideas and achievements. Genuinely, 1991 onwards, I think people have, certainly in some places, got into a victim frame of mind. There's no need for it. We are all capable of doing really good work, but sometimes we need that bit of support and encouragement that comes from simply talking about it with somebody else. And also it helps to maintain identity. Is there a new dawn for clinical and other applied psychologists? I believe so, but we have to think ahead and we have to think differently. We have to think afresh, because the only true revolution is a conceptual revolution. And I hope that today will be the start of that revolution for you. Now, if you want to follow up some of these ideas, we did, Derek Mowbray and John Newland and Mike and myself led a symposium at the recent DCP conference in Liverpool, and you can download a substantial document which includes our talks and overheads and what have you. And I hope that it will prompt you to think afresh.